This episode is proudly brought to you by G Recovery, the Central Coast's leading destination for health, wellness, and performance recovery. From infrared saunas and ice baths to massage therapy and soft tissue treatments, they've got all science-backed tools to help you feel and perform at your very best. To book your next session or learn more, head to grecovery.com.au. That's grecovery.com.au.
Go for it.
All right. Nicole, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ed. Been looking forward to it.
Yeah. So, for those that are listening, this is going to be kind of a 2-episode series, if you will, and we're going to do ADHD and autism. Today, we're going to be talking about ADHD. So, before we jump into that, can you just give us a bit of an overview as to who you are, how you got here, what your experience is?
Yeah, so basically, I started out working in organisations. So I was doing not as an organisational psychologist, but as a management consultant, working with leadership and culture in corporate teams. I really enjoyed that. And then I'd always wanted to do psychology. I had started it when I left school, but I also wanted to travel and go overseas and have fun. So applying myself at that age probably, I found a bit difficult. And so, I realised when I was probably in my early 30s as a management consultant that I'd be pretty limited unless I went and did a undergrad at least degree, which was the original plan to become an organisational psych. And then I just didn't stop there. And I went on to do my honours and then started practicing as a provisional psychologist and got into the area of neurodevelopmental disorders, which I absolutely loved because it covers all areas of psychology. And I like the variety and the ability to kind of go in and do deep dives across a number of different things rather than just sort of staying focused, I guess, on one thing like anxiety or whatever. I believe very much in being a really, like, knowing as much as you possibly can and being really good at what you do. But there's so much of that to cover in neurodevelopmental differences, and that's what I loved about it. And so I've been doing that pretty much from day dot, and moved up to the coast, and then I've worked in pediatric only clinics, and then for the last 5 years I opened up a clinic of my own focusing purely on neurodivergence. So, and neurodivergence across the lifespan. So not only, in pediatrics, but then the transformation into young adulthood and right through middle age up to old age now. So, and understanding how, I guess, those neurodevelopmental differences impact individuals depending upon what age they are, what their individual goals and unique interests are, and how their differences, or the differences in how they're wired, impacts their ability to be able to function in certain environments and achieve those things that they need to on a daily basis, but also those things that they want to.
And so what is it that you do kind of day to day now in your clinic mostly?
So mostly what we're doing is we've moved into an area called neuroprofiling. So one of the things that we've learned in the past, and this has been an ongoing thing since I first got into neurodevelopmental disorders, was the fact that there was, in Australia, we don't really operate necessarily, well, the clinics out there, in my experience at least, which is only, to be fair, on the New South Wales Central Coast, which is not, across the board. I wouldn't be able to generalise that across the board, but even so, like in looking for supervision, from anywhere in the country, we're not particularly advanced when it comes to understanding neurodevelopmental differences. And um, in the past 10 years in particular, there's been a huge amount of research that's gone into that area, and the landscape has changed a great deal. And so we are focused over at Neuronexus now on neuroprofiling. So rather than being able to take any particular person and putting them into a group, which is how most studies are done, you take a population of people that are affected by, say, for example, autism, and say, okay, they're more of uh, a group where they've got similar features per se, and so we'll run an intervention, and we'll see whether or not that has an impact, a positive impact on that population, as opposed to or compared to a population that does not that is
Mm.
not impacted, for example. And essentially, it's not really a fair way or a way of looking at it that's going to be particularly useful to those individuals, because being such a spectrum of disorders within that one group, the variance is huge in terms of how those, wherever it is, whatever features of themselves, of their wiring, are affected by the autism, for example. I mean, ADHD is also neurodivergence, but our focus has primarily been on autism, and ADHD affects up to 75% of that population as a co-occurring condition. That we've got to look at them individually, that it's of no use to cluster them together and make assumptions based upon that, because the interventions, the support, they don't work. It's not an effective way of doing it. So neuroprofiling is understanding each unique individual and looking at, well, what is their neurodevelopmental difference? Because the first thing, which has been difficult, is getting the correct diagnosis or
Yeah.
identification in the first place. That can take people years
Yeah.
to find someone who can actually give them an answer to what is actually going on in the first place. And many of them have been treated for a number of years for not the problem. So identifying the problem accurately, but then more importantly, then being able to go into that and identifying, well, what features specifically are impacting this person? Because, just because somebody has a difference doesn't mean it's not a disability. It's a difference. Disability generally comes in where there's a mismatch between that neurology and the environment that person needs to function within. And so we're interested in giving a person that map, that I guess control, the controls to how they're wired, so then they can navigate to where they want to go based upon that knowledge.
And so, kind of current practice is very neuroaffirming, strength-based, positive outlook, if you will. There's a conversation happening now as to this is, good practice in terms of harm prevention and being positive for the client's sake. But how important is it to have a full picture as to what the diagnosis actually entails? And so, when you're diagnosing someone with ADHD or autism, you want to be strength-based, focused as to this is what they're good at. But say, for example, if you're diagnosing a child and you're doing some education with parents, how important is it to really kind of discuss the challenges that they might face?
Very. So strengths-based is really, like, what that means is, I see that as really a part of neuroaffirming, and it's the opposite to what we used to focus on. And we still do. Like, when we identify a person, say with autism, for the NDIS, there is nothing strengths based in the reports that we've been writing to date. There is now an allowance in the plan from, the government plan from 2025 to 2031 that those reports will be more neuroaffirming. But the requirement is for the diagnostician, which is often either a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist, although that's quite rare that a psychiatrist will do a diagnosis for autism per se. They're far more prevalent and likely to be doing ADHD diagnoses. But essentially, otherwise, it's a multidisciplinary team. So a registered psychologist and or a speech pathologist who will do those. And the idea is to highlight the deficits, to highlight the challenges, because that's what the funding is for, essentially. And so when we look at now a neuroaffirming or a strengths-based approach, it's about not only looking at the challenges, because it's important to look at those challenges, because those are the areas that these individuals are often held back from. They're held back by those challenges because of the environments that they are forced to be in. And, children in school, for example, is just a perfect example of that. That's quite the assault to many autistic neurologies. Looking at, hey, this isn't a problem that we want to fix. This is a person who's put together perfectly, and we're trying to put them into an environment that is not matched to that neurology. Anybody, when they're put in an environment that's not matched to their neurology, in other words, they might be either in pain or too hot or too cold, or there's too much light or too much noise. They don't, something's too tight on them, they're uncomfortable or whatever. That person's not going to function as well as they might if they weren't in that environment. And if they are functioning well in that environment, it's likely going to be costing them a lot more of their energy to be able to maintain that, that appearance or that what appears to be calmness on the surface. They're burning energy at twice the rate of the other person, for want of a better term.
Kind of focusing on ADHD for today. In layman's terms, what is ADHD? How does it present in younger populations, if you will?
So ADHD is a very real condition. There's been a lot of questions over the years as to whether or not, it actually exists. It definitely does. When an EEG is done, you can see the different brain waves happening in a person with ADHD versus a person without it. And ADHD essentially is an individual who struggles to do a number of things, but they all pertain to the area of executive functioning. So being able to focus and maintain concentration on something that perhaps is not particularly compelling for them or interesting. So as a general rule, a person with ADHD is able to maintain focus on something that really interests them. In fact, they can hyper-focus on that, and become highly engaged in it, and be very difficult to get their attention to attend to something else. But they find it, as a general rule, difficult. So like sitting in university, if you're doing a topic that you're really not overly invested in, or if you're in a position in the room or whatever where you're not getting enough sensory input, because there are sensory processing differences in ADHD as well, then you're going to find it very difficult to maintain attention. So being able to get the information into your brain in the first place, so into your short-term working memory, is going to be more challenging. When we look at the dopamine theory of ADHD, that is because there are fluctuating levels of dopamine that a person has with ADHD. So there's not enough typically. So, that does not enable them to maintain focus and attention for any length of time. There is often differences in short-term working memory as well. So the capacity of the working memory can be somewhat smaller, and the ability to download information from the working memory can also be impacted. So that can be slower per se. But essentially it takes 7 or so days for us to consolidate a memory. And so when we learn something new and novel, we need to be able to maintain that information long enough for it to be processed through the hippocampus into a memory. And so that can be something that is impacted in ADHD, and certainly inhibition, so control of impulse, that is quite impacted in ADHD. So the ability to be able to stop myself from doing something that I want straight away, but that I need to discipline myself to do a bit later, you know. So what they call set shifting, so being able to move from one task to another can be impacted as well. So if I'm in a situation where I'm working and then I've got to then stop and then shift my attention to something else, that can also be impacted. And then my communication can also be impacted as well, primarily because I'm not necessarily stopping and thinking fully about what I'm saying before it might come out of my mouth, you know.
Yeah.
And I could be highly energized and looking for a dopamine high. You know, you often hear people say, oh, he's out there looking for a dopamine high. And that's because people think that dopamine is the happiness, I guess, chemical or neurotransmitter, but in fact, it's the novelty chemical. So dopamine is about novelty. It enables us. We're interested in seeking something that gives us a thrill because it's novel, and that's why when we're low in dopamine, we tend to not be overly, we might be inattentive, so it can impact sort of like I'm not really focusing on anything. I'm just kind of off with the fairies in my own world. Or I'm looking for that high, so I'm seeking that dopamine input because I love the feeling I get, when I do something that's quite novel and unique and new, and it doesn't bore me.
Yeah.
So if I've got ADHD, I'm quite intolerant to boredom.
Yeah. A pretty common misconception, especially a few years ago, was ADHD was the kids that were bouncing off the walls or they were troublemakers in school. And I think that there's that one kind of segment of ADHD, the hyperactive impulsive, that everyone kind of somewhat knows. But then we've got all these other categories of ADHD that no one knows. And yeah, I think the other misconception was ADHD goes away as you grow up. I think the stat was 50 to 66% of people will still show symptoms throughout their lifetime. You know, how much would be higher if masking was not really a thing anyway.
Just in terms of what you're saying there, like you're right in that it does show up in many different ways. So the person who struggles to be organized and sequence things, so plan, sequence, keep to time. There can be that time blindness. So there's so many things that can ADHD impacts. In fact, I would consider it to be a very impairing condition to have, difference to have in this day and age, in terms of how much we're meant to fit into a day, how much we need to organize our things and our time and achieve. It's when it shows up, when there's so many things a person with ADHD might be able to cope with a certain load of work expectations or activities in a day as part of their role in life, both from an occupational perspective, but as a friend, as a parent, as a a uni student, or whatever role it is that you're in. There is more and more expected of what we should be achieving. That benchmark continues to increase. And I guess, the difference is ADHDers per se will kind of peak at a much lower level, so it's like once they reach that threshold of, hey, I can only manage this much in a day.
Yeah.
Right. And once it starts to exceed that, then they can run into problems, as opposed to the person who can multitask and swap between those tasks and manage their time and, see the big picture and then backward plan, sequence things all the way down to the detail. So there are those factors there that, that come into consideration, but probably over the years, I guess, the most frustrating thing that we see in particular in pediatrics are parents who will come into the clinic with a very fixed view on medication per se. And it's not necessarily a fixed view on medication because they're not parents who necessarily have a problem administering medication. So if their child had a headache or if they had diabetes or some kind of heart condition or something, there would be no problem administering medication in that sense. But because it's a medication for the brain, often it's associated with their own experiences in school. We can come across quite blocked viewpoints of how effective medication is, whether or not, they believe that their child requires that medication. And the frustrating part is always is the evidence base that they have made those decisions on.
What are some of the
Um,
concerns that they have?
so particularly people who were in school in the 70s, 80s, 90s, even up to the early 2000s, where often, it would be that the naughty kids were the ones that were diagnosed with ADHD. And it would be, "Oh, yes, like Bob or whomever, he's been diagnosed with ADHD, and he's on Ritalin, or he's on medication for that." But we wouldn't see any difference in his behaviors. There was still these disruptive behaviors. There were still things that we could observe in the playground or in the classroom or whatever that, he was doing, that the medication really didn't seem to work. And then that person in their experience may have gone on to be unemployed or be, some kind of delinquent or criminal or something like that, or otherwise, just was unsuccessful generally. And so the feeling was, yeah, well, that the medication didn't work. Um, he was given, he was stigmatized because of it. And so, everyone knew that he was on medication and it was ADHD. And so everything that he did was attributed to that. And it wasn't of any use. So I don't want that for my child. So the intention is coming from a very protective, positive place, except that the questions around the validity and accuracy of that information, um, that hasn't occurred. It's just been accepted that he did have ADHD, that he was on medication, and that the medication did not work. And then as a result of that, the outcomes that that person experienced in their life was due to both the stigmatization and the ADHD and the fact that, the medication was not effective. And of course, there's nothing evidence-based about that. There are many, many questions when we go back and we think, well, that was our formulation from, childhood for starters, but we don't really know what his condition was. We don't know whether or not he had early childhood trauma, whether or not there were parental issues at home, whether or not it was autism or some other condition, whether or not, there were other learning disorders and factors there that, hadn't been taken into consideration, a chromosomal abnormality, any of those factors. We certainly have no evidence that he was actually diagnosed with just ADHD and that he was administered an ADHD medication, and then that after observation that medication didn't work. There's absolutely no evidence behind our belief that, we would have no idea, the most of us, about that, what happened in the mornings and what happened at home and what observations were made about that particular individual. So therefore we have no way of knowing why they wound up where they did. It could be a lower cognitive abilities. We just really have no idea, but we make these assumptions based upon what we think are good hard facts. But when you actually look at them, there is nothing factual about the information that we've based this conclusion that ADHD medication is not a good thing. It actually flies in face of the evidence, which is very much about medication. Some out there, Dr. Russell Barkley, will be who's world-renowned expert in the field of ADHD and has been for many, many, many years, been quite vocal about the fact ADHD is primarily treated by medication, and that unless the individual is medicated for their ADHD, then environmentally based or psychotherapy based interventions are limited in their effectiveness. Dr. Russell Barkley's terms is people with ADHD know what they need to do. So going in and being told what they need to do in terms of keep to time, put a timer, set an alarm, keep an organizer. They know those things, right? ADHD is actually a problem with being able to do what you know. And
Yeah.
the issue there is dopamine.
Mm.
By increasing the level of dopamine, it increases a person's ability to focus and concentrate, stop and think, plan and organize. So it lights up that executive functioning system. So in essence, if you think of it as a car, it's like, you're running a 4-cylinder car, but there's some kind of problem in the engine somewhere. And not enough fuel is getting through, to activate all the cylinders. So it's kind of running on, maybe 2 cylinders. So the hardware's there and there's actually, it works. But there's a blockage or there's just a cause. And the causes of, well, why isn't this person you just focusing on that dopamine theory? Why is it that they're not producing enough of that?
It's not the driver, it's the system.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so when they are provided with enough dopamine, then the system works. So it's, whereas if you look at somebody with, say, an intellectual disability, the underlying neurology is different. So it wouldn't matter how much education, for example, or dopamine you give that individual, that the neurology is not there for them to function at a higher level. And so with ADHD, it most certainly is. In some cases, we can see a difference on cognitive assessments alone. When we test a child with ADHD, when they are medicated versus when they are not medicated, and this is in a 1-to-1 environment, in a testing room, we can see an IQ point difference of up to 20.
Yeah, wow.
So it's quite significant, when, and therefore, in a learning environment in particular, it impacts working memory and executive functioning, and you can sometimes see it's not diagnostically, we don't base any diagnosis on it, but often you will see this pattern of a higher general intellect with lower cognitive proficiency around working memory and processing speed. So what it essentially means is that the general intellect is there, but the ability, I guess, to access, utilize, and learn is lowered because of the ADHD. And then the more interference you add into that individual's environment. So when we test a child who is not medicated and we see a cognitive difference between their general intellect, so their verbal and perceptual reasoning, so their image or their picture language and learning. So they're the two general ways, that we measure intellect, our visual and our verbal intellect. And then we look at, how well do we use and access those two intellectual domains? It's the ADHD impacts the efficiency and speed of that and accuracy as well. That little person is not absorbing as much in that environment, and the more interference we throw into that, what we would see that may well be impacted from a one-on-one assessment will generally be far worse in a classroom environment where there's so many more competing elements in the environment for that little person or big person to pay attention to.
Yeah, definitely. I think especially with the younger kids as well, it's like you're getting the symptom presentation from, you're getting 3 or 4 inputs. So you're getting parents' views and then you're getting teachers' views and whatnot. But then how do you generalize the symptoms when they're going into school and there's, 3 or 4 different variables that are contributing to that, and then their presentation at home is completely different. So
Well, technically, well, yes and no. ADHD, you kind of take that with you everywhere. Autism is you can get a completely different,
Mm.
like people sometimes say it's like Jekyll and Hyde,
Mm.
ADHD to a far, far lesser degree, you don't, if you're inattentive and you're a bit of a, bit of a daydreamer, and in the past, girls who, whole or generations of girls have presented with inattentive ADHD have been undiagnosed because they're
Yeah.
quiet, they're off
They
there like
just
thinking about other things. And,
Yeah.
so I think certainly when a little person goes in, so somebody who's quite hyperactive and impulsive goes into the classroom, they can get riled up, and you'll see the behaviors because they're spinning and they're climbing and they're moving and they're talking and doing basically everything because they're not entertained by what's happening in front of them. They can't maintain focus and concentration and
They'll be the
remembering.
same at home as they will be at school then.
Yeah, so it's like at school, it's going to show up because they're primarily at school to learn. So it's going to be really obvious if they can't sit down and if they're not following the instructions. At home, they might be given more of a free rein.
Yeah.
So they're running around, they're playing on swings and that sort of stuff. But the hyperactivity itself
Still there.
will be there.
Yeah. It's just
You know,
it's just in the environment it's more accepted. Yeah.
yeah, correct. And it's how that behavior is interpreted. As a person moves into adulthood, that hyperactivity that existed when they were younger can often just move into their brain. So they're thinking about 1,000 things. They're not spinning around, running around in a shopping center,
Kind of like
where
yeah.
driving everybody crazy, but
Mm.
they might be the busiest person, so they've got to be doing something all the time. And that can be translated actually into something really positive. They're people that just get stuff done. Um, but if we were to talk about the impact of that in relationships,
Yeah.
it doesn't always end well. Those type of people can be quite frustrating to someone who just wants to sit back and relax.
Yeah.
And then, when we looked, you mentioned earlier about, well, what do little people with ADHD become big people with ADHD? And yeah, I think about 66% of the time they do not grow out of their ADHD, and they become big people with either inattentive combined or hyperactive ADHD, and it's just as devastating at each level of life that they go through in terms of its outcome. But one of the things that the research really does support is that those little people who have been medicated for their ADHD in their earlier years, the both the severity and the likelihood of them having ADHD into adulthood is significantly reduced. So either they don't have ADHD, so the population whereby, they took a population, and this has been repeated on numerous occasions, and warrants probably, a really deeper look if you're talking about just the impact of medication for ADHD as a way of treatment. It's both preventative for ADHD into adulthood, or it's preventative for severity of symptoms. So they either were tested as, a much higher proportion of that treated in childhood population go on to have ADHD into adulthood, or their symptoms are significantly less
Yeah.
severe.
Yeah.
And that to me is profound because, whether irrespective of your opinion on medication for ADHD or not, people worry a great deal, as they should, and ask all of the questions of the pediatrician or the psychiatrist around, the side effects of medication. But there is not enough focus on the side effects of not medicating.
Yeah.
That's the insidious side of, you can see side effects of medication.
Yeah.
They're there in front of your face,
In the day.
yeah, but the side effects of not
Not
medicating
medicating.
are something that and are not discussed enough in terms of the impact.
So you have parents that are bringing concerns up about medicating, Is this the way that you'd provide some education as to what it would look like if you don't?
Very much so.
Mm.
In our Because we're rarely dealing with somebody who just has straight out ADHD,
Mm.
when you're looking at we work with complex neuroprofiles. So basically, there's several diagnoses from autism through to impacts on language, as well as ADHD, anxiety, and there can be health impacts as well, like in terms of how it impacts a person's gut, and digestion, their immune system, and they may have had epilepsy or may have epilepsy. That's quite a common co-occurring condition. Um, and so when you look at ADHD, and again, Russell Barkley has been quite vocal about the fact that, he said that he reports that ADHD medication is effective in 90% of the population affected by ADHD.
Mm.
However, most people are not treated. Now, when you look at the fact that in autism and ADHD, it having ADHD and autism together exacerbates the problem
Yeah.
and makes it more than just a simple combination of those two things. It's really important that we provide some education around um, the impact of both the ADHD and the importance of asking the person or the child's treating psychiatrist or pediatrician about the benefits of medication as well as the side effects, and for them to cover the side effects of not medicating. And that's why
Mm.
it's, in terms of what we do working with a multidisciplinary team, when you're looking at complex neuroprofiles like that, it's important to have a doctor, that's part of that
Yeah.
that person's support team to ensure that all of those factors are properly covered, because yeah, autism also impacts the executive functioning system in different ways.
And so kind of coming back to the co-occurring side of things, when you read through some of the literature, a common description is secondary ADHD and adult onset ADHD, but they're not established diagnoses, but they're
Mm.
just concepts. Dr. Mapu talks about you might have a kid that's very intelligent and sails through primary school relatively fine, but level of demand of work that they need to do is very cohesive with other people, and then they get to high school and it becomes very independent focused. All the scaffolding for support is taken away. Now they're failing. Talking about that so-called adult onset or the later kind of onset ADHD. Is that what it's really referring to, do you think?
I'm not familiar with his work, but upon hearing what you're saying, I would say that what he's talking about would be in relation to the fact that it's not necessarily started during adolescence. Being a neurodevelopmental difference, what essentially that means is it can show up at any time during development, because we're not fully developed until, particularly the brain, until males are a bit later, and that
Mm.
there's a between 25 to 30, and women, generally 2 years kind of, ahead either way. Now, that being the case, until that person has fully matured, there are developmental differences that can show up, and that means, and differences do not necessarily mean deficits. And that's the biggest thing that we're looking at even in ADHD. Just because somebody has a neurodevelopmental difference does not mean that it's actually a difference that's a deficit.
Yeah.
In many ways, it can be a difference that's an absolute positive.
Yeah.
And there's many, many, many examples of that, notwithstanding the whole new pile of information or influx of information that's come in with AI and the development. A lot of that is driven by neurodivergent minds.
Yeah.
And so, the question is a deficit or a disability occurs in it's the environment, is that neurology going to be effective, or can it function effectively in that environment? So I think that when it comes to understanding when these differences show up, it can be any time prior to the person reaching maturity. And it's generally where they meet the threshold of what they can cope with. So, often the transition between primary school and high school, where there is a drop in supports and there is an expectation of more independence, you see big differences in development generally in a neurotypical population. And those differences tend to be greater in a neurodivergent population. And it's just got to do with, okay, I've reached the threshold now.
Yeah.
Or, I was okay when I was supported. I functioned quite well. But here are the challenges now around independence. And so it's always been there. It was always going to be there. And now we're in an environment that is showing up that particular difference.
Yeah, it's a good way to describe it, I think, because it's been there the entire time, but it's not being dysfunctional until they're required to.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, kind of moving into more of the diagnostic side of things, I think the little research I could find on it, previous diagnostics saw ADHD. This is back in the 40s almost, as minimal brain damage, and then it was moved to hyperkinetic disorder of childhood, ADHD, ADD with or without hyperactivity, and then into ADHD, primarily inattentive, hyperactive, impulsive combined, and now we've got primarily inattentive presentation, hyperactive, impulsive presentation, and combined. What's your opinion on the categories that we're putting everyone into with ADHD and diagnostic?
Those categories change with the research over the years. We think that we're about 10 to 15 years behind in terms of what we see in a clinical environment to when it actually shows up in the research, because we research things and gather an evidence base after we identify something may or may not be a thing. We test that hypothesis, and we need to be able to check its validity and its reliability until we reach a threshold of evidence that we can say, okay, now this is a bona fide theory. It's a valid theory. I think it represents definitely the experience over the years that, well, not everybody shows up with ADD, attention deficit disorder, because we know that some people with ADHD hyperfocus, right? So it's like it's an intensity they do it's a lot of it.
Yeah.
So they can become quite they can be quite active, and that might be like when you're intensely focused on something, it's over. It's a lot of they can move around, they can sort of need to constantly move, or that they've got a seemingly great amount of energy that is either expressed in a way that's useful, depending on who the judge is, or not so much. But then the girls were the ones those girls that were inattentive, that are off daydreaming or in a non-attending state, which is that, kind of just in neutral. I think of it as a car. It's like I'm not really hurtling along. I'm just sitting there in idle, and I'm off until something salient comes along and I've got to attend to it. That's sort of how I see it. And then there's some, it's quite common for people to be, I guess, have less energy, off with the fairies in their own world, so to speak. And, hey,
come back.
Are you listening? Yeah. Like, what are you doing? Yeah. So, and then others that can sometimes show a combination of those two states. And they think that that's a person who presents with fluctuating levels of dopamine. So sometimes they have not enough, and sometimes they have too much.
Too much, yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of coming back to some more of the literature here, one of the ideas was when you're having the hyperactive impulsive type, this study compared it with kids that had ODD and ADHD, and they talk about the externalizing behaviors that come along with that. But one thing they highlighted was that you don't see that with the inattentive type. So when you have the ODD paired with the hyperactive type of ADHD, you'll have all these externalizing behaviors. But The inattentive type was just this mental chaos, but it didn't come out. And so they were just sitting there like there was so much going on and they were looking around, they weren't really engaged, but then they'll come back to the conversation and they'll be like, oh, what are we talking about again? They were half engaged, almost disassociated.
Mm.
How do you distinguish between the inattentive internal monologue and just the hyperactive externalized behavior?
Generally through observation. Like, so like in a child, you'll see, it'll be pretty obvious. Like, you'll see that child will be moving around a great deal. Like, they're looking for things to keep them entertained. They're talking. They're constantly filling every moment and not attending to the thing that they should be attending to. And sometimes they can be doing that as well because that focus and concentration, there might be too much information that they're confronted with. It's just too overwhelming. And they just can't hone in on, generally we can pay attention to, say, 7 plus or minus 2 pieces of information at any given time. Now, if there's a lot going on visually, like, and from a sensory perspective, they can become overloaded, and then they'll look to kind of keep themselves entertained. That isn't doing it. They can't focus on any one thing. It's too much. So I'll chat to the person next to me, or I'll, oh, that's shiny over there. I'll go and look at that.
Yeah.
They get distracted by other things that come into, they're not holding this one goal. And so, I've got a t-shirt that's like, says ADHD, oh, look, there's a squirrel. Like, it's just kind of like I get distracted on the way.
Yeah.
On numerous other things. And so that busyness, it's like I'm always, oh, look at that, and so then I'm off there and I'm like, what was I doing? I can't remember. I'm not holding this goal in my mind.
Yeah.
Whereas if I'm inattentive more so, I'm looking, and it might be that I don't understand or I can't hold my focus long enough to understand. It might be an internal dialogue. If it is an internal dialogue, that's why we've always got to be careful. Well, what is that internal dialogue? Is that driven by anxiety? Is it driven by other preoccupying thoughts? Is it trauma related? Like, what is it content wise that, because that busyness in there of overwhelm will often happen as a general rule, like for information overload, perhaps in the hyperactive mind. And we just need to be like, that how it's been described to me often in clinic is just like, I'm not interested, or I don't understand, or I really like the idea of it. And so I just drift off into that space.
Yeah.
I'm there thinking about, oh, this is what I've got to do on the weekend, or, and because I'm just not into whatever's happening, and I'm not going to be running around. I'm not trying to engage other people, or I don't need to expend energy physically and get up and go and do things. I'm perfectly happy off in this other world that I'm living in, and I could be imagining anything, if I'm imagining concerning things, then we need to be looking beyond and saying, okay, well, it might be ADHD, but other things like, autism certainly, but anxiety disorders, learning disorders, and any number of any other, of psychologically based issues, or environmentally based, or physical health issues could be preoccupying that person. So we can't just assume automatically that, that's ADHD. They're not paying attention. A much deeper dive needs to happen every time to find out, well, why aren't they able to focus and concentrate?
Anxiety can present with a lot of similar features to ADHD. The study that I read pointed out that because there's so much education on what ADHD is now, people will consume that content and then they'll build this kind of idea in their head that they have ADHD, and they might not, and they've just got anxiety or trauma and there's some issues there, and then they go and present themselves to get diagnosed, but they've learnt so much about the disorder they kind of present with the symptoms. So how do you how do you ensure that your diagnosing is valid when people are coming in with their own interpretations of what it is, and they're maybe over expending some of the symptoms that maybe aren't so dysfunctional for them in day-to-day life, not implying that it's conscious, but
The battery of assessments that you would use needs to be quite broad. You're not, we don't ever just use one assessment. There's a diagnostic interview. You want to get the history of that person. You want to find out everything that you possibly can
genetic
about,
factors.
their childhood, their development, their experience at school. Actually, potentially assess somebody they're on a psychometric test to see how they perform from that perspective, or any one or a number of those ones can be conducted, and then get feedback from others around them. So from home and or work and or school, teachers, university, whatever. Then have a look at the thoughts, like how that person's thinking and what is happening if they're not attending, like what are they thinking of during that time. Really do some thorough, like there are some pretty standard patterns for ADHD, and it always starts in childhood, so if, even those, this adult onset, if you will generally see that, there'll have been indicators during those early childhood years around, that they needed additional support, and when they had support, they did well, or some way of or something that alludes to an inattentive or a hyperactive profile at some point. But as a general rule, when you get to know that person and you do a really thorough investigation involving their own self-report, um, observations, psychometric assessment, standardized assessments, you'll come to a reasonable conclusion as to, what might be impacting that person. And then as psychologists, we don't medicate. We will do a referral as a general rule and say to a psychiatrist or a pediatrician, we're sending this person. Can you review the information? These are the assessments that we've conducted, and we've had a chat with such and recommended that they talk to you about the benefits or not of trialing a medication. And and then when they get to that point, a medication, if it is administered, it's then about assessing the impact of that medication and how that person functions. And of course, that's out of our hands. That's the domain of the medical professions.
Yeah. And so there's been a bit of debate online with, you mentioned before, Russell Barkley and Rob Mapu as well, I was speaking about as well. And they talk about combining, running diagnostics for ADHD, but also running an IQ and certain other metrics as well.
Yeah.
Barkley kind of argues that it's not very important to run an IQ test or other metrics solely for diagnosing ADHD. And Mapu's kind of the opinion that it helps to rule out other disorders that could be affecting their presentation. What's your opinion? Should you solely run diagnostics only for ADHD if that's the disorder you're trying to test for, or should you run it to rule out other disorders as well?
The answer on that depends completely. So with our clients, where there's often multiple co-occurring conditions, we would generally run an IQ assessment as well. Like that, there's a lot of nuances to that to answer that, and a lot of it that there's affordability for starters, from the individual perspective. So
Yeah.
what can they afford? Like an IQ assessment is
Yeah.
an expensive assessment. And then
That
when
was
you
one of
overlay
Barkley's
that,
points as well, was
yeah,
what's actually doable.
that's right. And so if it's quite obvious that an individual does not have an intellectual disability, then it's certainly very, very feasible to run an ADHD assessment without, the cognitive component, um, well, there's a couple of factors that relate to that, and that is that if they're at pre-diagnosis stage, then you don't want to be assessing ADHD, and then looking at also assessing IQ at the same time. And the reason why a number of psychologists get nervous about that, including myself, is because when you test somebody who does have ADHD, so say this person goes on to have ADHD, and it impacts their working memory quite profoundly. And so we run a cognitive assessment as well. Then again, we're going to get potentially this big difference between what their IQ actually is, so the full capacity of their IQ when it's got, when it's operating on all cylinders, so to speak,
Yeah.
versus what their IQ is when they're not operating, they don't have enough dopamine, for example, or the brain is not
Before there's a
regulated.
20-point difference.
Yeah,
sometimes.
and so for some people, that's a difference between telling the individual and or parents that their child or that they've got an IQ within the average range, like and much the same as everybody else, versus they've got an intellectual disability.
Yeah.
So I mean, if we look at 70, an IQ, a cognitive score of say 70 on your standardized, like say your WISC, for where we start to say, okay, this is now we're now in the range of intellectual disability, depending on then the functional assessment that also needs to go with that. Between 70 to potentially 90,
Yeah, it's a
which is
massive
kind of
difference.
in that average range, right? And that's a pretty big result to give someone.
Yeah.
And then we need to say to them, but we're not 100% sure that that's the case. And we can't test now for another 2 years.
Yeah.
So in our case, if we're doing an autism assessment, which is a big diagnosis in and of itself, and then we go ahead and we've done an IQ assessment, and then we're telling parents that potentially, there's also an intellectual disability because the impact of the ADHD is quite significant on the working memory or executive functioning.
Yeah.
That's a lot to take on in terms of information that may or may not represent an accurate picture of that person's capabilities. So if we can see that IQ is not impacted, we can see that they're presenting with cognition that is in alignment with, or similar to the age expectations, then you wouldn't go ahead and charge that. It would be do the diagnoses, and it depends on how certain you are on that diagnosis too. It depends on what the results of your other assessments are. And then once medicated, if that's the choice of treatment, then we will do the cognitive assessment, because then we're getting an image of what that person's capability is versus, and particularly where there's co-occurring ASD, versus what that person's going to be, I guess, their functioning capacity when they're not medicated, which will be worse when they're out there in the classroom or at work or whatever.
Yeah. And so kind of going more into the medication, when is it appropriate to medicate? When is it not?
That's for a doctor to answer. So I'm not a doctor, so I can't provide a definitive answer on that. But speaking as a psychologist on that, I would think that, the time to medicate is when the person it's confirmed that, yes, there's highly, we can never be in psychology 100% sure, at least most of the time. If there's a chromosomal difference or whatever, we can do a blood test or an assessment for that, and we can get the results back and be certain that there is or is not, an impact or a difference in the chromosomes. But for the most part, you can't do a blood test for ADHD, right?
Yeah.
You can do an EEG, but even that is not diagnostic in and of itself. So we're always gathering information and coming to the most likely logical answer. But there's always got to be that knowledge there that you can never become stuck in that, because when new evidence presents itself, we need to rehypothesize. We need to retest and recheck that we're still landing at the same place. But when it's been established that it is most likely ADHD, and we can see that there is a significant impact of ADHD, of the ADHD on that person's functioning, then I would think that that's when I would do a referral to a psychiatrist or a pediatrician to ascertain whether or not, a trial is the next step of medication.
Are people with ADHD more susceptible to excessive screen time and phone use?
Yes.
Mm.
Yep, definitely. And that's because it's about the set shifting. It's about being able to shift their attention. Um, Social media offers a lot of novelty. And so being able to discipline myself to go and do the things perhaps I need to do or I should do versus doing those things that I want to do. There are a number of mental health challenges that can also come along as a result of ADHD. So, generally people who have got ADHD, will have heard many more negative comments about themselves throughout their life. So, Ed, I told you to go and do this. How many times do I have to tell you?
Yeah.
Stay focused. What are you looking at? Where's your homework? Like I've asked you to do that. Right. I'm going to take that off you. They often are in trouble a lot. Okay. And because they're not following instructions, they're not paying attention, they're losing things, they're disorganized, they're not on time, they're not. So there's a lot of negative feedback often that individual has received throughout their life. And so their self-esteem and sense of identity can be quite severely impacted by that. And so being online and getting involved in something that's distracting takes their mind away from. That's what there's so many avatars around now, and like the avatars, it's almost like, they represent what I want to be. That this is the good me. This is me in my at my best, or in my, when I'm inattentive. This is who I am, and so I can escape into this world where I don't have people at me. In fact, I'm a Green Beret or a Navy SEAL or some kind of person with a lot of power and respect. And I'm good at this gaming, and I can actually stay focused and concentrate because it entertains me. It gives me novelty at every moment and every corner. I succeed here. I'm willing to take risks, and I don't die. I just get another man back. And, this is not a real world situation. So absolutely, people with ADHD are far more prone to being undisciplined when it comes to social media and gaming and things like that. And they say things without, they might be more reactive online and things like that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Romantic relationships. What's the kind of presentations you're seeing there?
So ADHD in particular, people with ADHD in relationships, the studies show that there is more of a propensity for them to not be faithful. There's certainly a higher rate, for example, of teenage pregnancies in ADHD. In relationship with a person with ADHD, you're looking at all of those, their ability to organize, plan, stick with something, focus, and be disciplined to follow through. If you're looking at, okay, they want to increase their credentials or something like that, the chances of them sticking with that course, following through on that are far more or more unlikely. Comes back to novelty. So tolerance of boredom, the ability to, focus, so paying attention to detail, getting the kids ready for school, organizing all of their homework or lunches and doing things in a timely manner, being able to, I guess, think about things before they go ahead and do them. So there's the propensity for addictions, definitely. Gambling and alcohol consumption and drugs and things like that, that inability to kind of just, this is what, we do these things only every now and then, that because it feels good, that attraction to, that novel feeling, that good feeling. The list goes on when it comes to, sometimes people get so hyper focused. I've had people where their partner with ADHD has literally just forgotten about them at, say, Bunnings or something. They've literally just gone, right, I'm going and I'm going to go and I've got this plant now and away I go. So they're not coming back up to the big picture and going, hang on a second, I've got, such and such, my wife or my husband or my kids in there,
Yeah.
driving into work, leaving their kid in the car, forgetting to drop them off to, daycare or whatever.
Yeah.
There's all of those factors that can, money management is another huge one. So budgeting and being able to discipline oneself to, no, you can't go and buy that shiny thing that you want. We need that for over here. Yeah. So there's many, many ways that having a relationship with a person with ADHD can be quite frustrating if you do not struggle with those same differences. And then the propensity for them to kind of be attracted to each other is about familiarity and understanding. Oh, me too. I struggle with that. So the expectations are often altered because though the individual with ADHD is not so great at those things, well, then they tolerate it more in another person. Whereas when you don't share that same neurology, it's far more
That's a bit
difficult
of
to,
understanding, yeah.
It's similar to the, that double empathy kind of theory in autism, in that, there actually isn't an issue with empathy, people who are autistic. It's that, neurotypical individuals don't understand how autistics empathize and vice versa. But when there are two autistic individuals together,
Mm.
empathy is not a problem, and the same with
Yeah.
two neurotypicals together.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's why it's that similarity, familiarity. But again, when the negative side of double ADHD comes out,
Yeah.
it can look, mum and dad have got ADHD, and then generally because it's quite, it's a heritable trait that
Mm.
children are likely to have ADHD, and so
Yeah.
they show up to school with, who knows.
Also,
Dedication's missed, and the lunchbox isn't matching what's meant to happen, and they're rolling in. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's quite. We see a lot of that where it's just a genetic load in a family, and it's chaos.
So there's a lot of talk. It's been overdiagnosed. ADHD is becoming more prominent in
Yeah.
society. What's your take on that?
Yeah, look, the overdiagnosis question always pops up. Like, so when we learn something new, there's been a huge amount of research that's gone into ADHD over the years, and that continues as we learn more and more, which is the way we want things to go, is to deepen our understanding of these different presentations
Mm.
and make sense of them so that we can best support individuals who present with variations in neurology. So there's always the question of, are we overdiagnosing? And very much so, it is the research supports that there is fundamentally, there's been a severe underdiagnosis of ADHD, and that is particularly a big problem in adulthood. So that ADHD was like, okay, that's a childhood issue. By the time you reach adulthood, it's disappeared, and so we will forget about it after that. And so that has left a great deal of adults who may have been supported by ADHD medication when they were younger, um, with symptomology into adulthood that looks very different, depending upon what age they are and where they are in life, and their circumstances. But I think that the fair answer is that there is some overdiagnosis, yes, because we always have an issue with clinicians who perhaps are working in the area of neurodevelopmental differences and disorders, who do not have the depth of understanding of that area,
Mm.
that are jumping into diagnostics in that space. And then also people are able to come in and mask that
Yeah.
they have ADHD and answer those, given that we do not have a definitive, way of measuring, like blood test or any type of scan that tells us definitively that the person does have ADHD. So there's certainly those two factors. But then there is also underdiagnosis as well. So conversely, we still have a huge amount of adults and kids, that are underdiagnosed. They don't have a diagnosis, and whose functioning would improve a great deal on a daily basis if they were treated. And that's because either they're not seeking, intervention or an answer as to why perhaps things may not be going how they'd like them to, or they don't see them as an issue, or they don't know that they're able to get a diagnosis, and then people's belief in whether or not it even exists. So both exist simultaneously. There is both overdiagnosis and underdiagnosis going on at the same time. But I would say for the vast majority of cases, there would be an underdiagnosis. We've got generations of people with ADHD who would have definitely benefited from treatment in that space, and that didn't happen. So
How often do you see that you're diagnosing a child and in that process, one of the parents goes, oh, wait a minute.
90%.
Yeah, wow.
I would have to say,
Yeah.
a lot.
Yeah.
A lot. The apple often does not fall too far from the tree.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And for those that are interested, you'll be back for an episode on autism.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to come back. So, I really appreciate you having me on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Cheers.